We'll move on to the last portion of this plenary, the morning opening plenary. And even just introducing the two speakers makes me feel intellectually more astute. We will have a fireside chat between two very eminent people, Gita Gopinath and Nivruti Rai. Gita Gopinath is a professor of economics at Harvard University, and before that, she was the first deputy managing director of the IMF, and before that also the chief economist at the IMF. Nivruti Rai comes to us as the CEO and managing director of Invest India, but she also has an excellent private sector background at very senior levels before that. So Gita and Nivruti, the stage is yours, please.
Very good morning, everyone. I must say that with rapt attention, I was listening. And Mr. Iyengar, everything that you said, went straight into my heart. And I'm really, really thankful people like yourself, are truly being the bridge. I have lived in United States for a very long time. And I can tell you that if you don't come to India, and you don't see the change, maybe not 24 times in a year, but you remember India of the time when you left. But the world is changing, and a lot is happening in the geopolitics front. There was a time when trade defined the economics, and globalization was happening. What is happening today is geopolitics is defining economics, and a lot is dependent on the factors that are moving around in the world. World is changing, money is flowing in the changing world, money flows from here to there, trust is being eroded, trust is being built. So in all of that, I'm really, really honored to be able to hear what Gita has to tell us, because I feel that the world today is seeing a lot of confrontation. The world today is seeing a lot of breaking up into different components, different trust factors, and a lot of instability. But during that, the very determined middle powers like India are thinking of charting a new path. And with that, my very first question to you, Gita, is in this world which is changing, the economy is being driven by different factors. What is the ground truth that the world we are living in? Is it a phase, or is the architecture of economy changing?
Firstly, it's a pleasure to join you, Nivruti, on the stage. And thank you so much to MR and Sanjeev for bringing me here. I'm proud to be part of the Indian diaspora, and it is a phenomenal group of people around the world who are contributing to wherever they are, but also contributing back to India. And congratulations on the report that you put out. I think the facts were really interesting in terms of how the Indian diaspora contributes. To your question, I think it's, can you hear me? Is it working? All right. To your question, I think this is a particularly salient moment to recognize how much the world has changed because of what is happening in the Middle East right now in terms of the Iran conflict, and how important geopolitics is for the global economy and for the Indian economy in this context. And it also ties to the Indian diaspora, because a third of the Indian diaspora lives in the Middle East. About a third of the remittances that come into India come from the Middle East, so it's a substantial part of what's contributing to the Indian economy. If I want to pause and think about what might happen, I think right now we're in a very complicated juncture with respect to the war. we know that President Trump has said that he's given the Iranians an ultimatum, which is by the end of Monday, he would expect them to open the Strait of Hormuz, or he would be destroying their power plants and more of their infrastructure, and Iran has decided to respond and say that we will respond in kind. So at this point, I think the question is what comes next is really difficult. And I think this captures a bit of the world that we're living in right now, which is the tremendous uncertainty about the global economic landscape, about where things are going. And this has big consequences for India. To your question about more generally, how have things changed? I would say we've had a profound shift in how the world works. The US, which created the rules-based international economic order, has moved decisively away from it. Why? It's a combination of things. I think one is just in terms of the preferences of the leadership, which is President Trump has always been in favor of tariffs and protectionism. And so that's one big reason. But also it's a reaction to the sense that global trade has been unfair to America, and China has been responsible for important jobs being lost in communities in the US. Also, national security concerns have come up, and this came up especially after the pandemic, but also Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so that's where we are. We've fundamentally moved away. We're not in that period when we had open borders and open trade. The world does not look like any other time. I mean, there was a time when there could be parallels made to the Cold War, when you had two blocks, and you had the US bloc and the Russia plus bloc, and maybe now it would be the US plus bloc and the China plus bloc. I don't think that's the world we're in right now, because there's been, in terms of actions taken against other countries, it's not just been against China, but it's been against European allies and so on. So it's a very, very different world to live and navigate. The one it's positive, I would say, is that unlike what happened during the Great Depression, or during the period between the First and the Second World War, when basically every country tariffed and counter-tariffed each other, and there was a full-scale trade war, we don't have that right now. So while it is true that China has retaliated to tariffs from the US, the rest of the world hasn't. So if you look at how much of trade is still conducted under the World Trade Organization's rules, that's about 75% of world trade still goes by those rules. So it's a different system in that sense, hanging together.
I know, based on what you said, the US bloc versus the China-Russia bloc, IMF did this analysis which said the world from the GDP perspective will lose 7%. And that's huge. The second thing is, while we are all rejoicing that, the trade challenges and the tariff challenges with US has been resolved, but, pre-Trump era, 2.5% to on an average 14% is a big difference. I think the largest since 1971 that we've been seeing. And, while we talk about tariff, I think there's a lot of dependency on supply chain while these blocks are forming, these friend-shorings are happening, these technologies are being challenged. I honestly feel this Iran war that you talked about is not just about oil. It is oil which translates into power, which translates into technology, and therefore, supply chain and looking at alternate sources becomes really, really important. My ask to you is, what is your thought when it comes to supply chain and supply chain independence, I would say. My team and I built a block chart, a pie chart, and we realized that the amount of dependence that we have in China for raw materials from solar to EV to rare earths to even shipbuilding is huge. So with this kind of 14% tariff, How do you feel that, India can manage with the supply chain diversification strategy? Like I was saying, the middle powers are getting determined, Canada, India, France, to get out of this supply chain dependence jail. What is your thought? What should India's strategy be?
We are seeing important shifts in terms of who trades with whom. So if you look at the overall numbers in terms of global trade to GDP, you've seen that decline a tiny bit, but it's not changed that much over the last few years. What has changed is under the surface in terms of who trades with whom. And while previously China had a big share of US imports, that's changed by a lot. So the direct trade between India and China has dropped sizably. But on the other hand, you've seen trade, especially with Vietnam and Mexico, having gone up by a lot. So this is both a combination of China setting up manufacturing plants in Vietnam and in Mexico. So it's not just about these countries providing their own supply, but it is the fact that China now sells a lot more through these different countries. So you've had rerouting of trade that we've seen. Now, to your question about where does India come in, India has, over the last decades, increased its export presence in the world, but it is still not a very big player in global supply chains. And that has always been a challenge. Now, especially when it comes to manufacturing, and this point came up earlier too, it isn't the case that India has been able to substantially raise manufacturing activity over the past decade. It's still a challenge, and we know several of the stumbling blocks over there, which is in terms of land acquisition. You see spots of improvement in that space. Similarly, in terms of labor, again, you see spots of improvement. The ease of doing business, the complication of getting contracts, the complications of clearing things through the bureaucracy, all of those remain important challenges. So for India to be able to truly seize the opportunity and become a big player in global supply chains, one is it should continue to do what it's doing really well right now, which is building infrastructure. Do that in terms of ports and so on. The more infrastructure that can be built up, that is very valuable. This is both physical infrastructure, but I also think the digital infrastructure is phenomenal in terms of what UPI and what that's taught the world. I think that's a major contribution. But then getting these other aspects, which I mentioned in terms of land and labor and ease of doing business, is going to be quite critical for India to be a much bigger player in terms of global supply chains.
So Gita, I completely agree with you. But having said that, I'll just share some numbers with you. I was in a discussion with Carlyle Bank, and they said over the last 6 years, they have invested $6 billion. And in the previous panel, you heard a lot of repatriation, taking the money back, IPOs is happening. They have taken back $6 billion, and $6 billion still remains in India. 6 years, $6 billion investment, $6 billion withdrawal, $6 billion still stays. Now, having said that, do I agree that we have challenges with ease of doing business? Oh, absolutely. And that's why, the government has placed people like Invest India to handhold the investors and, travel the journey till they get the return of investment. And I honestly believe that everything else which you talked about, ease of doing business, I think if a business person sees return, he or she is willing to travel the bumpy roads while India builds its infrastructure. And I just wanted to share some thoughts with what Invest India does. So we are open to all channels of investment, and my bigger role is not just to bring investment, but return of investments, and work with the investor to see how do we help them, bypass this little bump that is there, which government is working on. And when I looked at, I have met in the last 7 months, 7 global boards. None of them is saying, why India? All of them are saying, how can I invest? How can you make the execution faster? When can I see the return? So the question about, why India is not there. It's how India to wow India is what we are working on. And I like to see, and you know, you called out some countries, and therefore I must tell their strategy, and I'm learning from all of them. I have never, ever thought that I want to out China by, beating them or something. I'm learning from them. So Vietnam has 54 free trade agreements, has, you know, sitting in the lap of luxury, I would say. When I look at Malaysia, they actually intentfully build electronic ecosystems, and they are showing really good progress there. Mexico, you know, IMF says a lot of nearshoring will get the 7% GDP loss. They have been beneficiary to friendshoring, Chinese manufacturing. Saudi Arabia, a lot of sovereign wealth fund, you know, led inward investment. And rest of Southeast Asia, a lot of Chinese. But then what is India's strategy? And we were talking to the government. We were making a presentation to, you know, the big leaders of our country. And my one-line approach was, India, and mark the few words that are very important for all of you to know. India is going to become a trusted partner for sustainable manufacturing. We don't have the luxury of fossil fuel, so sustainability is key for us. Manufacturing is key for us. And having worked in Intel for 30 years, I can tell you, Vietnam was not born with it. Malaysia was not born with it. I myself, as part of Intel, went there to these countries to skill the people. So do I believe India can be skilled? Oh, absolutely. And do we have a plan for manufacturing? Oh, definitely. All of these incentives that the government is putting are jump starts, are crutches. Because we are not today, we are 22% cost disadvantage to China. Therefore, these crutches are required. But believe me, with the kind of hunger that we have, you walk down the streets of New Delhi or, Bangalore here, and see the aspirational grassroots businessmen using the Jam Trinity and the bank accounts and the magical device called phone. So you will realize, and that's why I absolutely loved Mr. Iyengar's, you know, approach. Hold hands with us to see what's in our heart, what's in our mind, and what our hands are trying to do in terms of delivery. So my question to you then is, Gita, India needs about $1 trillion in the next 2 to 3 years. And we've actually, $1 trillion every 3 years. And, you know, we've done some calculation to see how much of it is local versus foreign. FDI, while, you know, it increased by 73% in 2025, FPIs pulled out $9 billion just in March. You have warned the world is dangerously dependent on US, and I heard that in Davos. If that corrects, does capital come to India, or does everyone freeze?
I think it's helpful to think about where the money has been going, and especially over these last, let's say, year and a half, when we've had these big changes in terms of US trade policy with the world and geopolitics and so on. So initially, there was a sense after a decade, so I would say from around 2015 till about 2024, there was one direction for capital, which is it went towards the US. Just striking, because usually you would think that you would see capital going to many emerging markets, but instead it really came towards the US. And for good reason, because the US economy was dynamic. Tech, I mean, it's hard to beat the US in terms of the tech activity that's happening over there. The dollar just strengthened the whole time through that decade. So for all those reasons, you got the best money returns when you put your money in the US, and therefore, we have never seen this level of international exposure to US equity. So that's the point you were making, which is that if there were a correction in US equity markets, the consequences would be much bigger for the world than it was during the 2000 dot-com bust. Then the question is, what has changed in terms of capital, right? Do you think that people are diversifying? So what we did see in 2025 was not a dramatic shift, but you saw that on the margin, more money was being put outside of the US too. So there was more diversification happening. It's not as if people were withdrawing money from the US on a net basis. You actually saw plenty of capital flow coming into the US too. But on the margin, some part of the portfolio was being invested elsewhere for the reason that there was good reason to question whether US equity markets were really overvalued at this time. So it went into Europe, it went into emerging. It probably was one of the best years for emerging markets, 2025. Not for India, but for emerging markets as a whole. It was one of the best years. And then you saw everybody's stock markets adjust up. And so, whatever high levels of undervaluation there were before, I think most of that has been wiped out. Now what we're seeing with the current episode of geopolitics is that there's been, again, a flow of capital to the US. So the dollar has strengthened. The US stock market has declined some, but by less than many other stock markets have in the world. So again, as an investor, if you looked around and you said, where would you get the biggest bang for the buck? The US still looks like a very attractive destination, and especially in this incredibly volatile world. So in terms of capital coming to India, I would say that has been a challenge for a while. So in gross terms, there's been more foreign direct investment come in, but on net terms, and you can tell me some more about that, in net terms, net FDI, it's not been at very high levels. In terms of portfolio flows coming into India too, that has been more restricted, and we've seen the pressure on the rupee for most of the last 12 months. So for multiple reasons, and there have been multiple shocks, I would say there were the tariffs that were an important issue. There is the current crisis with the Iran conflict, which is particularly consequential for the Indian economy as compared to, say, the US or even some other countries in Europe, all of which is putting pressure in terms of the, at least in terms of portfolio investment of money coming into the US. So the way I think about it for India is in terms of raising the amount of capital that you said will be needed. I think to an important extent, it will also have to come from within in terms of developing domestic capital markets, domestic bond markets. The Indian equity market is always seen as a bit stretched. There's so much money that pours into it that it's less stretched than it was maybe 2 years ago, but it still is, second only to the US in terms of price to equity ratios, price to earnings ratios. And so developing more of other forms of capital in India, domestic capital markets, domestic bond markets, the way banks lend, having maybe a little more increase in credit creation through the banking system, all of that will be important to generate large amounts of capital.
I completely agree. We need to look at debt market, bond market. I was just reading about, the world debt that the world is servicing today. And I realized that the amount of debt that US has to service is more than the amount that it is spending on defense. So learning from that, I think debt market, bond market in India has to really, go full speed. Having said that, just something to clarify. India saw last year $80 billion of FDI. Of the 80 billion, 50 billion was fresh equity, 30 billion was reinvested earning. Of the 50 billion fresh equity, 25 billion was institutional investors and 25 was industry. So that's on the plus side. Gita very rightfully mentioned, what about the net FDI? Let me give you the story on the net FDI. Net FDI said $50 billion were repatriated or disinvested, and 30 billion was the outward FDI from India. Outward FDI going into primarily US, UK, and Europe. Now that tells me the frontier technology in US is absolutely essential for India to partner on. Now, therefore, the outward FDI, when we studied, it was either for manufacturing or for market or for IPs or for molecules. Now I studied what the 50 billion repatriation was and what I learned. While RBI does the yearly math, I come from a math background, so I have to study the time series. And I realized, and in the previous panel, we talked about IPOs. Largest number of IPOs, the main board ones, and significant amount of money raised. But who did the people repatriate? They were the ones who had invested 10 to 15 years ago. Now they are seeing benefit. The world has 3 trillion backlog of PE VC money. Which country is offering them return? Is India. So when after 10 to 15 years, when they did IPO, they are repatriating money. And that doesn't mean that I have to worry about. Of course, I'm watching every single variable that contributes towards net and gross. And I realize that as long as the investors have faith in India and the number from the top of the zero keeps increasing, we have less to worry about. And therefore, I'm continuously trying to work hard to bring in investors, to handhold them for return of investment. And just to give you one number, Invest India does not drive all FDI into the country. Just this last year, 6 billion was already facilitated by Invest India and countries. Like I said, there is a lot of confrontation, there's a lot of instability. All of that is making countries look inwards. And I'm very happy to say that Europe is standing tall in looking at itself to say who are their partners. US, while all of the tariff that we are talking about, I cannot give you the name, but one company is committed to invest 8 billion in 3 years. So yes, we have challenges. Yes, we have bumpy roads. We are fixing it. And we are working with each and every one of you. I love diaspora. 15 years I've lived in US. I went to school there. I am essentially part of your diaspora, but I can tell you, 35 million people is the population of New Delhi NCR. Roughly 150 billion, I'm just doing manager math, I don't want to do 130 and then struggle with the division. 150 billion, assuming, is the diaspora money. Do you know what the GSDP of the state of New Delhi is, the NCR region? Only 300 billion, which is 50% equal to New Delhi's NCR GDP. It comes from diaspora. That's how important you are. I also want to tell you, India's philanthropic money is 15 to 20 billion. Several billion comes from diaspora. I am looking at every possible channel of investment, and I'm telling you, the focus for our country has to be frontier technologies, has to be AI. I'm not worried about, AI taking our jobs because, history tells us, including Kennedy's report, I'm forgetting which magazine it was, it did in 1964, Gita, where it said that 5.4% unemployment will happen because of automation, industrialization. 10 years later was double the jobs. So I know AI will be challenging, but I really believe India plus, I know. So I'm going to finish with one takeaway that I have to say. The world isn't waiting to see if India can deliver. India will deliver. India isn't waiting for the world to decide. The 1 trillion every 3 years, 80% is local. 20% is foreign. And that's the shift that I'm seeing. And this room is the bridge for that 20% that I'm looking forward. Your institutional knowledge and your knowledge of the country is what I believe that will drive the growth of the country. All I feel is we have to execute and we have to move fast. And do I believe? Oh, absolutely. Gita, you have any finishing words to say? I know we are
I know we're well over time, I guess, in the good Indian tradition. No, I mean, again, I think there has been tremendous progress in India over the last many years, and I think somebody mentioned it's important. You mentioned it's important to come to India many times. I come numerous times, and I'm always impressed with the changes going around and the potential. I think it always helps, and this is just personally my own style, which is I think it also helps to face the hard truths in terms of what needs to be fixed and what needs to be done, and not just talk about the potential and how we're all wonderful at holding each other's hands. We can be honest, and we can point out the issues that need to be addressed, which is, again, a responsibility of ours.
I wish we had time for public Q&A, but unfortunately we are over time, and so we don't. But this has been such an excellent fireside chat, one of the things I was most looking forward to as part of this event. So delighted to have had both of you. Thank you so much. They're waiting for a picture. Go ahead. Thank you, Nivruti and Gita. We'll now move into a coffee break. So we are running a little bit behind schedule, but I do want to try and keep the trains running on time to the extent I can. So I'm going to make up a little bit of time. Instead of ending the coffee break at 11:15, which was the scheduled time on the agenda, we will end the coffee break right outside here at 11:30, right? So we'll make up a little bit of time there. We'll still be behind schedule, but we'll start the breakout sessions at 11:30, all right? So thank you. Look forward to joining you.